Thank you, everybody, for being here. I'll go ahead and get started. I think I took the TED Talk aspect of this too literally, so my talk will be slightly less technical and perhaps more, we'll make up for it in different ways, hopefully, but I apologize if it doesn't. My name is Khawaja Shams. I'm the co-founder and CEO at Momento. My co-founder, Daniela, is local, but she couldn't be here because she's not feeling well and she didn't feel like sharing her germs with everybody. But next time, she'll be here. We used to work together at Amazon, where I ran DynamoDB, and after that, I ran product engineering at Elemental, which was a great acquisition for AWS and turned into 7 AWS media services, and a lot of them are very excited for their own reasons. But jumping right into the TED Talks style. So I want to talk a little bit about the little origin that could. And you know, every superhero has an origin story. And I'm not saying that we're the superheroes by any means whatsoever, but every superhero has an origin story. And it's usually very enticing, and you can get millions of views talking about the origin story of a superhero. But there's one origin that I think does not get anything close to the amount of appreciation it deserves. Now, I'm not talking about Blue Origin, although you all talk about SpaceX way too much compared to Blue Origin. But I'm talking about your video origin. Regardless of how many live events happen, record-breaking, millions of viewers, 100 million plus viewers. We talk about the bandwidth records, the concurrent viewers. We talk about the multi-CDN distribution that allows you, all that arbitrage that allows you to pull off these insane records. But the thing at the center of it all never gets talked about because it's, you know, doing this thing behind the scenes and doesn't really, if it's doing its thing right, you never actually notice it. But when it's not doing its things right, you do notice it. So and the closest thing that I see people talk about for origin is the origin shield, which is important, right? Like we talk about origin shield a fair bit, but I feel like the shield is important, but what's more important is the thing that the shield is shielding, which is Captain America or your media origin. So I'm here to make a case that we should appreciate the origin a little bit more than we do today, and specifically your media origin, because it is, at the end of the day, the center of it all. And I want to start, I added a little bit of animation because Zach said his slides didn't have any animation. So these are all added while Zach is talking. But I want to talk a little bit about Media Store, the little engine that could, or the little origin that could, rather. Media Store is a small service inside of the Elemental portfolio, which focuses on the 99.99 percentile latencies, the errors. So, you know, it's very much optimized for core performance on the origin side. And the reality is this matters a lot more than people give it credit for. Not Media Store in particular, but just the origin itself. And the reason for that is, you know, the player bandwidth, the bandwidth that's available to your home viewers, is highly variable. We don't live in a world where everybody has a constant, you know, internet connection. The variability comes from people's Wi-Fi. It comes from, you know, who else is working inside the home. It comes on what else is happening in the neighborhood. It comes on, you know, whether a base station is dying, whether somebody gets in the elevator. There's a whole lot of things that are kind of going on that impact the variability of the bandwidth that is available to the player. And this might be a little too basic for everybody here, but the player is the superhero, which is basically forever chasing that live look-ahead buffer and making sure that it keeps downloading it as much as it can before it runs out of that buffer and the viewer has to watch the spinning wheel. So this player is working really, really hard, chasing every segment with all its might, trying to get access to that next segment. And every little delay that gets in its way to get that segment decreases the viewer experience in multiple ways. And what's happening here is that every time the player finds out about the existence of a segment, it has to go download it. But the entire time that it's waiting to find out about the next segment, let's say it had a bandwidth blip, that time is completely underutilized. And the total amount of video downloaded by the player is the area under this curve, right? So there's opportunity cost every time you sit here making the player idle. Now, in the grand scheme of things, if everybody's player is sitting idle all the time, it's good for everybody else. But if I want to be greedy, I want my viewers to obtain as much of the bandwidth from all of their neighbors as they can so that they like, my experience better. And once in a while, because other people are just as greedy, my player will do this, like my player bandwidth will do this. And what I don't want to be doing is wasting all the bandwidth that was available to me here and causing my player to buffer when it gets here or lower. So this is the superhero, the player, that is kind of just chasing this origin. And the viewer experience, based on this bandwidth, based on how the player can perform, is impacted in a few ways. It's not just the buffering. It could also be, the player is making live choices, dynamic choices about what bitrate to play. And it's doing calculations. And if it decides that, hey, I can't really keep up because it doesn't matter, but maybe it can't keep up because all this idle time is sitting there, it may decide to lower the bitrate, which means your viewers see lower quality video. Or it might cause buffering. Or it might be both, or it might cause crashes if it's not able to download the right manifest, or if it downloads an older manifest, and so forth. And what you don't control in these environments is the Wi-Fi. I'm very frequently surprised by how terrible people's Wi-Fis are. In my family, I get to go in and diagnose everybody's, home internet connection, and it often surprises me how much everybody in my family pays for their monthly internet connection, but they have really cheap Wi-Fi hubs. But you don't control that, right? Like for your players, you got millions of players. They might have really bad Wi-Fi, or they might be on 5G because they think 5G is going to be better than 2.4G and don't realize that, well, 5G is really nice when you're right next to the router, but when you go upstairs, your 2.4G is actually going to perform better. But you don't control any of that. And you don't control the ISP. You don't control any of the packet shaping that's happening there. And you don't control little, Timmy that is, turning on, 5 other videos behind the scenes impacting the player that, your viewer is watching. So these things are completely out of your control. What you kind of control is CDN, because if you're doing multi-CDN arbitrage, you can decide to penalize or reward CDNs based on their performance. So you can be looking at, like Prime Video does a lot of this complex thing where, where they optimize which CDN is getting how much of their traffic based on cost, based on performance, and so forth. They can do this very, very dynamically. So you can kind of, create like a reward system to somewhat influence the CDN. But at the end of the day, you don't really control the CDNs either. You have minimal control of what they're doing at each individual pop. And you have minimal control of if they have, a deployment that collapses, their request collapsing, and boom, comes to your origin. And that's where the shield comes in at play. But what you do control is your origin, kind of. Really, it controls you because it sits at the center of it all. So you've got the CDN. That's talking to the origin. You've got I was making this at the last minute. I put a camera here, but this is supposed to be your encoder. So your encoder is constantly uploading, the manifest, and it's uploading the segments back to the origin. And little errors. If your CDN returns an error to a user, that's one user that gets impacted. It's maybe OK. In the grand scheme of 100 million plus viewers, one user gets an error. They'll retry. It's fine. The encoder's manifest upload gets an error. That means that the encoder has to try again. And that means that for that period, while the encoder is sitting there trying to re-upload the manifest file, all of the polling that is happening from the CDN, from the origin, and the player to the CDN to the origin, they keep getting stale manifest, which don't have access to the latest segments, which means you have that underutilized area under the curve where you're not actually downloading and causing either a degradation in quality or degradation in, or causing a buffer. Same thing for segments. If there's errors here, or if there's a latency, if the origin just takes an extra few milliseconds to absorb it, that is time that's going to delay the manifest to actually get uploaded to the origin as well. And all of that is fine. I mean, this is where it's really central, where the manifest and the segment coming in from the encoder is really, really important. But the same thing happens when a CDN POP sends a request to the origin, and the origin is slow to respond. It's not one request that's being slow to respond. It's every request that is sitting there waiting on that POP for that manifest or that segment to show up. And we get back to the underutilized area under the curve, that during which time your player is not downloading. But unfortunately, origin is an incredibly hard business. And that is why it's hard for people to make origins, and like as SaaS providers to build origins, and simply because at the end of the day, you can have a 100 million subscriber event, but you're not going to do, I think Zach mentioned, with 1,600 channels, you're seeing like 2,000 TPS at the origin. It's very, very modest. It's crucial, but very, very modest. And we hear new guidance from Amazon and from others that you can just use S3 as the origin. I don't think that's necessarily the best approach, because S3 is more of a generalizable store. Media Store was more of a specialized store. And I think there's a place in the world for specialized origins. And the reason why, just going back to it, the reason why it's a hard business is, at least if you look at the way Media Store is priced. I remember when I ran the service, we would serve really successful, massive events. And the revenue generated during those events would not even cover the pizza for the team that came in to support it. So it's very true. So it's a hard business. And I can imagine why it's not the most lucrative business, but it is an important business. And I just wanted to remind everybody that your origin really, really matters. And where I learned all this was building Media Tailor, which was Amazon's personalized server-side ad insertion service. This is supposed to be a needle that's, you're stitching. I'm not the most creative, but I do what I can with the Keynote clip art. But at the end of the day, the summary is origin amplifies your problems. Any problems at the origin are meaningfully amplified because the POPs are relying on it before the players are relying on it. And that's supposed to be a megaphone. And every millisecond matters, because every millisecond that the origin is delaying is increasing that underutilized opportunity. The staleness of the manifest matters. The tail latencies matter. So people talk about average latencies, people talk about P99 latencies, but for the origin, what you think might be 1 in 99 or 1 in 50 is actually impacting thousands of customers. And errors matter even more at the origin, because if you're making the encoder retry, then everybody down the stream is waiting for it to happen. And if the origin breaks, you might have some redundancy, but the blast radius is inevitably pretty high. And that's like a door where you're opening, like it's a shield, but when you open it, the shield is broken. Anyways. And I will end this with one quick confession. So Johnny is here. We used to work together back at the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory. And back in 2012, we stitched together in under a week this live streaming service where we went to CloudFront and we said we want to stream Mars rover's landing in live. And the headquarters had given us some estimates and said, here's what the previous landings, what the traffic looked like. So what Johnny and I ended up doing was we took all the estimates and we multiplied it by 2. And then we gave it to our AWS account manager, who said, this is nice. I'll just be safe. They multiplied it by 2. They went to their manager. The manager went to the AWS executive team. Every step of the way, people kept multiplying it by 2. And the projections that were given to Amazon were just absurd, eventually, by the time it made it to the GM for the CloudFront team, to the point where the CloudFront team said, we're probably not going to be able to handle this scale. But if you really want to try it, you can build your own distribution network on EC2. So we built this 2-tier Nginx cache system in under a week with all kinds of redundancy. We were in every region, we were in every availability zone, and we had these units of EC2 stacks that could pop up and take on 25 gigabits per second each, and we were able to just deploy them one at a time. And it was a really, really fancy system that was stitched together in a week. It was heroic. Everybody really loved it because it didn't fail. We got to go talk at the AWS 2012 reInvent keynote to talk about how quickly we put it together and how great AWS was. And the little secret that we never told anybody was all of that, multi-region, multi-AZ setup with 25 gigabits usage was all being powered by one FLS server running on a MacBook Pro. And if that had gone down, it doesn't matter what our CDN that we whipped up in a week would have been able to do. With that confession, that's it. Thank you so much for being here. Oh, this is a, Matthew talked about all the content creators. This is one of the content creators that we got to work on. This is the Curiosity rover. It was obsessed with itself, and it used to take selfies before selfies were cool. This is 2012. It is very obsessed. The field of view on these cameras that I got to work on is 1 degree. And this is actually a collection of 5,000 plus images. So it basically sits there. It doesn't have a lot to do. So it just sits there and takes so many pictures of it. And 5,000 pictures stitched together created this. This is not an animation. It's not an artist rendering. This is an actual stitched together 5 gigapixel image of the rover taking lots of selfies around itself. With that, thank you so much for being here. Thank you, David, for restarting the in-person meetups for the Seattle Video Tech Group. And looking forward to hanging out with some of you after at the happy hour.
Thanks, Khawaja. That was awesome.